couple of weeks ago, I picked up Blackmagic's new Pocket 6K Pro. Today, we're going to talk about my thoughts so far. So, Blackmagic released an update to their Pocket Cinema Camera lineup. Building on the 4K and the 6K models, they've released the new 6K Pro. Now, I've owned the Pocket 4K in the past for a very brief period of time and have a little bit of experience of shooting with Blackmagic cameras, but haven't used them for a fairly long time. So, I'm making this video essentially as someone who's very new to the Pocket line of cameras. I've been looking at picking up a cinema camera for a little while now, and there has been an abundance of cinema cameras being released at cheaper price points than ever before in the last couple of years. Just seemingly they just keep coming, but there are a few reasons that I ultimately ended up not choosing some of these other cameras and instead going with the Pocket 6K Pro. Ultimately, the main thing was it was the best available option for my budget. The Pocket 6K Pro is, in my opinion, by far the best bang for your buck in terms of a budget cinema camera that you can buy today. And that's because of a few things that I'm going to talk about in this video. The ability to shoot 6K raw video, dual native ISOs, built-in ND filters, 2 mini XLR inputs, and an industry standard color grading software included. It's insane that you can get all of that for under £2,500. So let's take a look at the camera. Now, the 6K Pro is in many ways very similar to the Pocket 6K that came before. Sensor-wise, it's identical. The same Super 35mm sensor that has a 1.558 times crop and shoots the same resolutions and frame rates. Up to 50 frames a second in full 6K, 60 frames a second in 6K 241, 5.7K, 4K DCI Ultra HD and 3.7K anamorphic, and up to 120 frames a second in 2.8K and 1080p. But it does allow you to shoot 4K B-RAW now, albeit at a pretty hefty crop into the sensor. It has the same EF mount, the same claimed 13 stops of dynamic range, and the same base dual native ISOs of 400 and 3200, with the changeover between the two circuits taking place at ISO 1250. Now, all of those technical specs are the same as its predecessor, and if you want to see a couple reviews that go more in depth into the regular 6K, I'll leave some links to a couple I like down in the description below. But on top of all those things, the 6K Pro also adds some incredibly welcome additions. And the one that I was most excited about was the introduction of built-in IR ND filters. The ND filters in the Pocket 6K Pro are 2, 4 and 6 stops of IR ND, with the 2 and 4 stop filters stacking to create the maximum 6 stops of ND. There have been some videos and talk online about these ND filters giving a color cast to the image, some saying it makes it slightly cooler, some saying it pushes the image to a magenta tone, but I haven't really experienced any extreme shifts in any of the shots that I used, and I would say that any color shift that I've noticed has been comparable to any other NDs or variable NDs from the likes of Tiffin and Hoya that I've used in the past. Plus, with the added benefit of shooting raw, although it's an extra step in post, it's fairly easy to counter any slight shift with a white balance adjustment. Another incredibly welcome addition is the 1500 nit tiltable screen. In the few times that I shot with the Pocket 4K before, the screen, although it was a lovely 5-inch screen and it was beautiful and big, the lack of any articulation and the brightness levels, which I believe is rumored to be around 400 or 500 nits, meant that in bright sunlight and in any situation where you're not shooting from eye level, it was incredibly difficult to see what you were doing. And it almost necessitated that you had to use an external monitor pretty much at all times, which wasn't a huge issue if you were rigging the camera up, but sometimes if you do just want to shoot with a fairly minimalist rig or on a gimbal, you don't want to have to rely on an external monitor. So having that super bright and tiltable screen was always going to be a welcome addition. And the other main thing that drew me to this camera was the extended battery life compared to the previous model. The Pocket 6K Pro takes Sony NPF 570 batteries, which Blackmagic states gives you approximately 60 minutes of battery life when recording 6K RAW at 24 frames a second with the screen brightness at 50%. Now, given how much brighter the screen is on the 6K Pro, a lot of the time you won't need to be brighter than that 50%, particularly if you're indoors. So 60 minutes of pure recording time without stopping and taking breaks, I'd say is a pretty respectable number. And when you add in the new Pro battery grip that I've personally picked up, that adds an extra 2 batteries via connecting pins to the bottom of the camera, meaning that you don't have to take out the one that's already in the battery compartment. you get 3 times the amount of power and battery life when you use that battery grip. That's 3 hours of non-stop recording in 6K RAW, and in real world scenarios where you're shooting on and off and maybe turning the camera on and off between shots or between locations, you're going to end up getting a lot more than those quoted 3 hours. Before we get into my thoughts and feelings in regard to all of these improvements and how I found shooting with the camera in my first couple of weeks of owning it, I think I've gone far too long without showing you some footage from the camera. Although, actually this whole talking head portion of the video and the entirety of my last video on the channel was shot with the Pocket 6K Pro, so you have seen a little bit of some footage. Now, I haven't been able to use the camera in lots of different scenarios, however I have taken it out just for a couple of walks in my local area and got some very basic clips. All of the shots will have the lenses and codecs and all of that information down at the bottom of the screen, and in regards to grading, I've simply used a color managed timeline in DaVinci Resolve, converting the Blackmagic film to Rec 709 and doing some basic exposure and contrast primary adjustments. I haven't played around with colors and some of the more advanced DaVinci Resolve options that you can, purely because I wanted these clips to show you the Blackmagic Gen 5 colors that you get straight out of the camera. So let's take a look. When I first got back and looked at the footage, I was pretty happy with the results. It was the first time in a while that I've been really excited to look at the footage on a big screen when I got back from shooting and dive into an edit and see how far I could push and pull the image, although obviously for those clips I did take them back to their base state. B-RAW is absolutely an amazing codec. I've only shot 12:1 compression, but I had plenty of scope to play around with the image still, whilst being able to record all of that onto a SanDisk SD card, or my Samsung T5 SSD if I wanted to. Now, I haven't shot anything spectacular and I want to use it for some more work soon and test it out in some different scenarios to see how it handles shooting in other form factors and codecs, etc. and frame rates, but for what I did use it for, I really enjoyed both the process of shooting and the ease with which I captured good looking imagery that looked pretty good straight out of the camera without much work. Overall, I've absolutely loved shooting with the Pocket 6K Pro in the very limited uses that I've had so far. I already knew that the Pocket Cinema Camera lineup from Blackmagic was obviously incredibly good value, and you could get some beautiful cinematic imagery at such a low price point compared to its competitors, but the extra additions and upgrades that are present in the Pocket 6K Pro make me so glad that I waited for this camera, and I absolutely think that if you don't own any of the other Pocket cameras or cameras from Blackmagic and you're looking for a recommendation, this would be the one that I'd recommend buying. As for the new additions, the NDs are so incredibly easy to use because the 6K Pro is a slightly bulkier design. The grip on the right hand side of the camera is a little bit deeper and slightly more comfortable than the cameras that came before, at least in my experience. And because of this, the NDs are right where your thumb sits when gripping the camera handheld, and they just make it a breeze to add or to remove ND and to get the correct exposure for your shot. And as I said, in my limited testing, I haven't experienced much, if any, color shift at all. The battery life was an incredibly welcome addition and was actually quite surprising for me in real world use. I didn't use more than the initial 3 batteries that I put in the battery grip shooting any of the clips for this this video and I still had plenty of battery life to spare. I did use the official Blackmagic NPFs that have 3500 milliamp hours, so they are slightly larger NPF 570s. I know you can get 2900 milliamp hour batteries that are a lot cheaper on Amazon and places like that, but they probably won't get you quite as much battery life. I'll leave a link to both the batteries I used as well as some of the cheap alternatives that I picked up as spares in the description. I think in terms of actual shooting, if you use the official Blackmagic batteries, you absolutely could reasonably expect to get those 3 hours of recording time and most likely half a day or so if you're stopping and starting recording and turning the camera off and on between takes. It's just such a huge upgrade from the Pocket 6K and 4K that came before, and it's definitely something that puts this camera, at least in my eyes, worth it over the others. And finally, the tilting screen is incredibly lovely. It's very bright. I've rarely had to go above 50%, but even in bright sunlight, 100% was completely fine and easily viewable, easy to get focus and check exposure, and the extra nits of brightness are such a welcome addition. The ability to articulate the screen as well is amazing. I can hold the camera down at my chest or waist level when shooting handheld and frame everything up and make all of my exposure changes without having to bring the camera up to my eye level. If you already own a Pocket 4K or 6K, I'd think about what you really desire from a camera as to whether it's worth upgrading. If you've built up a big rig that already takes into account the battery life and has a monitor built in and everything like that, and you know you're going to use that rig, then maybe it's not worth upgrading because you have all of that already built in and accounted for, and you don't necessarily need to make the change. But the extra battery life, NDs, and tilting screen just make this a far more versatile camera to use in many situations. And so if you can afford it and are deciding which camera from the Pocket lineup to pick up, I'd recommend this one. Now, there absolutely are a couple small limitations and issues that have been well documented in many other 6K Pro videos, and I did find one of these teething issues in my camera, and that is the slightly blue tinted LCD screen. Now, it's a big, beautiful and bright screen, as I said, but it is definitely on the cooler side and a little too blue for my liking. When shooting raw, white balance obviously doesn't matter so much, as obviously you can just adjust it in post, but I would like to use this camera in ProRes, I imagine, for some of the projects that I've got coming up, and with the screen how it is at the moment, I just don't think I'd trust white balancing purely based off that screen, and so I'd have to add an extra external monitor to be able to do that. I'd say that the screen runs a good few hundred, probably even 1000 Kelvin cooler than it should do, and even the white text in the menu systems have a slight blue tint to them, so it is just across the board. I'd have to rig up an external monitor to really nail and trust my white balance, or just exclusively shoot raw, which isn't really ideal. That being said though, it may be my eye, or maybe the screen is just slightly fixing itself, but the last couple days that I've shot with it, it feels like it's not quite as bad. At 5600 Kelvin, which is white balance 2 right now, looking at the back of the screen, it doesn't look as blue as I remember it being, and that fully could be just in my mind. I'm getting used to the screen, but I think it's slightly adjusted. But absolutely, opening it out of the box and turning it on, it was just way too blue compared to what it should have been. Hopefully this is something that gets fixed fairly quickly with a firmware update. I know that Blackmagic are aware of it, so it's not the end of the world, but it definitely would have been nice to have this correct just straight out of the box. But in terms of issues, that's the only thing that I've really found to be wrong. Potentially the more I shoot with the camera, of course, the more issues I may discover, but right now it's just the LCD screen. Now, just as a little bonus, if you've got this far in the video, I did use the camera to shoot another video that's coming to the channel soon, another photo shoot on film using a 35mm camera, just taking some fashion and portrait shots of my good friend Carmela. And here's a very brief peek with a couple of extra clips from the video that are shot with the Pocket 6K Pro. Now, these clips I did push and play around with some of the more advanced features of DaVinci Resolve, like HSL sliders, keying, creating a look and adding some film grain and all of that. So just be aware that these few clips are not the colors that you're going to get straight out of the camera, but they do show you how far you can push and show the flexibility of the B-raw files that you can really use to grade and create a look that you want. So that's pretty much everything. I'm going to be using this camera going forward for most of the videos on my channel, and will most definitely be making some more content about it too. If you're finding my channel through this video, please feel free to check out some of my other videos. They mainly focus on photography and specifically film photography, but if you want to see some more Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro content or videography focused content going forward, please feel free to subscribe, because I will absolutely be making more content like this and more video focused content alongside my regular film photography and photo stuff in the future. But that's it for this one. Please do let me know your thoughts on the video or on the Pocket 6K Pro. If you've shot with it or you're wanting to shoot with it soon or looking to pick it up, let me know down below in the comments. I'd love if you liked the video, if you enjoyed it, so that I know what to make more of, and subscribe if you do want to see some more of my content. Stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you in the next one.